Meeting is now live streaming.
Can you see it?
I see it. It says meeting is now live streaming on Facebook.
Awesome. All right. Well, I am Kristen from the ADHD Casey. I am super excited to be here with Elaine Taylor-Klaus. I have seen her talk at a couple different conferences, and she's always amazing. I have read her Parenting ADHD Now book, and it was fantastic. It was advice that I wish I would have had when my daughter was much younger. I had to admit to her tonight that I have not read her newest book, The Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids with ADHD, Anxiety, and More, partly because it came out during the pandemic and partly because my youngest is way in college, and so I'm not really parenting her as much anymore. So it's low on my list of things to do, but I am very excited to hear Elaine kind of give us some of her parenting words of wisdom. And she is very well known in the ADHD world. She has helped serve on the board of directors for CHAD. She serves still on one of their committees. She has helped with ADHD guidelines, working with the Academy of Pediatrics. She is very much a real expert in the field, and we are just so pleased to have her here tonight. So I will stop the screen share.
Do we want to, are you want to recording this? Do you want to record this?
The Facebook Live does record it. So
oh, cool.
You should have it if it works.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. It's so good to be here. I'm really glad to be hanging out with you.
Thanks. So I don't know where you want to start with your book.
So, you know, let me think about what I was sort of telling you a little bit about the book, and that's really where I think I want to start with why. Somebody asked me recently, you know, you've already written a book. Why did you write another one? And part of it is because I'm a writer and I can't help myself. But mostly it's because, like you, when I was raising complex kids, it was really hard to find guidance and advice that worked for me. And I was, you know, I was dutifully reading the parenting books that all the experts told me to read. And they weren't really, they were interesting and helpful, but there was always kind of this point that they never got to, that it's like their experience ended and my life kept going, right? I know you can relate to that. And so for years, since I started doing this work, and I've been doing this over a dozen years now, I really, it was like I wanted there to be a general parenting book for those of us whose kids are not exactly typical. Right, for those of us whose kids color outside the lines, and we want to encourage them to do that as well as possible, right? To reach their potential, whatever that is. And you know, and I went through the years of reading the kind of specialty books, right? The you know, is your sensitive child or the anxious child, or, you know, all of those stuff. And again, they were all helpful, but none of them were like, I'm a big picture thinker. And none of them pulled back enough to give me that bigger picture of what do I do with this kid who is quirky and complicated and brilliant and bizarre and all of these things, and how do I support these, not this, but these kids in all the different circumstances, not just in their anxiety, or not just in managing their attention issues, or not just in managing their dyslexia, because my kids have all kinds of complex issues. But I wanted something that was more general, that was about isn't there something that can support me in whatever's going on, regardless of what my kids' issues are? And that was my experience when I discovered coaching, was that it was the first time I found something that actually worked, that really helped for all the different issues I was dealing with. And I had, you know, by that time I had 3 kids around 10 and under, maybe a little older, with probably a dozen diagnoses between medical diagnosis and mental health and learning disabilities. And I mean, there was a ton of stuff going on. And coaching was the first thing that kind of worked for everything. It wasn't like I had to pull from this or that or this or that. It was like, oh, it can help me with this and help me with this and help me with this. So, so that's what got me into this work. And that's when Diane and I met. She had a similar experience, Diane Dempster, because we initially started Impact ADHD about almost 10 years ago now. And And that's what we had in common was when we became coaches, we became better parents, and it wasn't rocket science, right? It was something we could teach. And so this is the book I've been working on and wanting to write for years, because I wanted to write sort of that book, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So That Kids Will Talk. I wanted to write that for our audience, like the Spock's parenting book, the Sears parent, like I wanted that classic book for the complex audience. And so that's what I think is what I'm really excited about is to talk about what makes it different. Why do typical parenting styles not work for our kids, and what's the shift that makes it work? Does that resonate?
Huge, huge, because I know that all of the things that I read in parenting books did not work for my kids. They just didn't work.
Or sometimes they did a little bit.
For a day or two.
Right, just to make you feel like a really bad parent.
Exactly.
Right, just enough to feel like a total failure as a parent. And that is not a unique experience, right? And so what I realized is that the traditional parenting books are supporting kids who have kind of a more typical relationship with cause and effect, if you will, right? For a typical kid, if you put a rule or a parameter or whatever in place and they break it and there's a consequence, it's going to begin to modify their behavior. That's how behavior modification works. It's going to change what they do. For a non-neurotypical kid, for a complex kid, if you put the parameter in place, you set the expectation, you put the consequence in place, they do the behavior, they have the consequence, that's not going to stop them from doing the behavior again, because they're not doing the behavior willfully or intentionally to be bad or to break the rule. They're doing it because they can't yet help themselves, because they don't yet have that, either the executive function developed or the capacity for self-regulation. So
neurological.
In fact, it might be neurological, and sometimes it's even metabolic, right? I mean, if you think about it, because sometimes you got kids with asthma or allergies or even a juvenile diabetes or celiac they have to modify their behaviors in order to comply with whatever their health condition is, right? But those require a lot of executive function that a 10 or 12-year-old kid may not have yet, right? I had a kid who had celiac disease at 10 years old, and the discipline that it takes for a child to not eat gluten and to check, in those days, really check at a restaurant because nobody knew what gluten-free was, that's not easy, right? And that's not within the normal expectations for a child that age for their development, right? So the real issue here is, again, it goes back to kind of cause and effect. And what Diane often says is, when parents come to us and they say, is it naughty or neurological? Which is something we talk about a lot. There's a whole section in the book about, is it naughty or neurological? If you're not sure, our suggestion is start with the assumption that it's neurological, right? Chances are you're dealing with a complex kid, that's what it is. But if you really want to test it, then you put a typical consequence in place as if it's not neurological, and you see how it works. If it doesn't work, which is more than likely, then that's going to give you a pretty good indication that it's not naughty, it's neurological. Because if it were naughty, that condition would change the response. So when you've got a complex kid, you really have to understand what's motivating the behavior in order to change it or adapt it. It's not enough just to put a carrot or a stick in place. You actually have to understand what's causing that behavior, whether it's lying or procrastination or not doing what you ask them to do. Whatever the behavior is, if you want to test and see, if you want to stimulate them to change it, to do or not to do something, right, as the case may be, then you've got to understand what's causing them to do it in the first place. And if what's causing them to do it in the first place is, let's say impulsivity, then you're going to have to deal with that differently than if what's causing them to do it is shame from being tired of being wrong all the time and not wanting to make a mistake. or if what's motivating it is a lack of effort and it's just too much effort to get up and go brush my teeth, or which is an executive function issue. We may call it lazy, but there is actually a motivation behind the behavior. And so a lot of times parents will say, well, my kid's not just motivated to do anything. And that's actually not true. The fact is your kid is motivated to sit on the couch, to play video games, to not brush their teeth. They're highly motivated to do whatever it is they are doing or not doing. They're just not motivated to do yet what you want them to do. And that's because we need to step back and look at the context that behaviors are happening in. We don't want to look just at what are they doing or not doing, but we want to understand what's going on for them. We really want to put on our lens of looking through our kids' eyes and understanding what's going on, because what's motivating or stimulating their behavior is going to determine how you come up with a problem solving around it. Because, I can just give you a star chart or a word system or tell you, here's a system to use to fix this problem. But it may not have anything to do with the problem. If the problem is coming, let's go back to that example of, so let's use an example of a kid lying. All right. We all deal with kids who lie, because guess what, y'all, kids lie. And that does not make them moral reprobates. I promise you, that doesn't mean they're all going to jail. It just means that kids lie, and they lie for a lot of reasons. And our kids lie more than typical kids. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One of them is because they get into what I call defensive dishonesty. They've gotten so tired of being wrong for so long, so tired of being everything they do wrong being pointed out, that they start to defend. Sometimes they lie because they think they're going to do it, right? Like, I'm going to turn in that paper, so I'm just going to say it's already done, right? Because they anticipate it, they've planned to it, they're gonna try harder and get it done this time. So it's almost like a wishful thinking, right? Those are just two examples. And so when you look at a kid's behavior and say, well, this kid is lying, I need to put a consequence in place so they don't lie. You have to actually understand why they're lying before you can help them change that behavior. So is this resonating? What's coming up?
Hugely resonating. It's like bringing me back 10 years. Yes.
Yes, 10 years. That's not bad.
Yeah.
Pretty good. Well, and I was thinking about, you were saying that you've got a kid in college and you're not actively parenting, but we are still parenting at that age, right? We're still parenting all the way through. It's just our role shifts in how we do that. And that part of what our work is about at Impact Parents, and what I think my book is largely about, is helping parents understand what our role is in relation to our kids. Sort of, where is it that we start? Where do we tend to get stuck, right? Because a lot of us get stuck in what we would call level 1 parenting, right? And where do our kids need us to be in order to foster their independence? Because our goal is to help them become, the executors of their own life, not to become the expert on them, but for them to become the expert on themselves. And to do that, the change actually starts with us, not with them. And that's, I think, what's so hard for parents to understand is, if my kids has the problem, why am I the one that should get training or help or support? But the truth is that it's because it's how you communicate with your kid that begins to foster that independence and begins to help them learn to take on responsibilities.
Very good.
So we got anything coming up on Facebook, or should I just keep sharing stuff?
We've got a Jeremy.
Hello, Jeremy.
She has your book, and I know that at one point she put her piles of her book or your book on her porch. I remember seeing that at one point.
I was going to say she has more than one. She is the most loyal, fabulous human on the planet. So.
And no, Jeremy, there are no slides.
No. Is that boring? Should I add slides? I can go pick up something. Maybe I'll find a Liberty puzzle somewhere. Okay, so we've talked about why traditional parenting styles don't work, right? So it's really about cause and effect. But it's also, I think the other thing that it's about is, how do I say this? So classic parenting paradigms, right? That classic old world paradigm of because I said so, I'm the parent, you need to do what I say, I deserve respect, you should pay me respect because this is what happened, what was expected for me. That world that we were raised in doesn't exist anymore. And so part of the other reason I think that parenting approaches need to shift in this world is because our kids are exposed to so much earlier, and the expectations on them are so much higher, that they have a stronger need to learn to exercise control earlier than we did. And because there's so much more, in a way, they have more exposure to the world, but in another way, they're so much more controlled than we ever were. I mean, we were, go to the mall, go down to the park, go to whatever, come back before dark. And these kids live in a much more contained, even before COVID, much more contained, controlled environment. Like parents know where they are at all times. There's a lot more tethering. There's a lot more monitoring, and with good reason. It's a very different world, and they have, the world at in their palm of their hands, and there's all these shifts. But because of that, they don't have as much opportunity to exercise self-control. And I don't mean in terms of following directions, but I mean they don't get a lot of control. They don't get to make decisions for themselves. Back in the day, we used to negotiate with the neighborhood kids, and we would find our way down to the local mall, or we had more agency in our lives because the world wasn't so observant or protective or whatever. And I think these days, kids don't get to exercise as much agency or self-control or whatever you want to call it. And as a result, they're getting into control battles with us more. They need us to begin to cede control to them appropriately, but to give them a chance to practice exercising control for themselves, so that they do learn how to do it before they leave the house, so that they do know how to be involved with the process of making decisions for themselves. And when helicopter parents and snowplow parents or lawnmower parents or whatever you want to call them are sort of clearing the way every way, the kids are not learning to manage themselves. And I don't mean just in terms of the self-regulation that kids with ADHD are dealing with, but I mean in terms of anything. And so part of the process of the shifting our style of parenting is about finding other ways to give them control, because those classic childhood ways are no longer available to them.
Right. We do have a question that came up.
Okay.
I'm not sure if this is in what you want to talk about or not, but how do you distinguish between ADHD and autism issues in the same child? And I guess the follow-up to that is, would it matter if you're using a coaching style?
I was going to say, my question is, does it matter? I often say that when you're looking at different diagnoses, as a physician, it matters for you, right? You have to know what the treatment protocol is and what the medications might be. For me, as a parent educator and a coach, on some level, it doesn't matter, because again, the point of this approach is to understand what's going on with the child in terms of their brain, their wiring, their motivation, and their proclivities, right? And when you understand that child, you can help them learn to navigate life. So it doesn't really matter whether the child has autism or ADHD. What matters is what's the behavior that's being exhibited, what's causing it, what's the challenge with it, and what's the motivation for changing it. And so there are certainly medical reasons to distinguish between the two. But from a behavior management perspective, there are certain things that may work better for a kid with autism, or some things that might work better for a kid with ADHD. But that has more to do with whether this child is more hyperactive and this child is more anxious, than whether there's one or the other diagnosis. Do you agree?
I agree. And
Okay.
if the poster of that question has any further follow-ups, let me know.
Yeah.
There is a delay, so we'll have to see.
Yeah. I got it. Well, I'm just curious whether, as a doctor, would you answer that differently?
I think from a behavioral standpoint, you have to reach the child where the child is.
Right.
So some of that would depend on how much the child understands things,
Yes.
not their age level, but their ability level, and knowing your child and how they respond to things. I know some kids
Right.
respond differently just based on their personalities, regardless of their diagnoses.
Right. And what you're speaking to is exactly what it comes down to. The reason that this approach works is because what we're looking at is where are the kids developmentally, not where are they chronologically. It doesn't matter if they're 9 years old and they, quote, should be able to do whatever. What matters is this kid is developmentally more like a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or whatever, and is not yet ready to do whatever was expected. That's what matters. I remember having this conversation with a client who had a 9-year-old boy, and all she wanted, Kristen, was to be able to come home and make dinner and have her son go upstairs and take a shower in a time appropriate manner by himself while she made dinner for the family. And I was like, well, it's a great thing to want. I can respect the wanting. But when you look at the kid and say developmentally, how old is he really? Is he 9 going on 10? Well, no. What is he, 9 going on? No, 6. Would you expect a 6-year-old to go upstairs by themselves, take a shower in a time appropriate fashion without any intervention from you while you go make dinner? And of course the answer would be no, it's not a reasonable expectation. So that's because when we set unrealistic expectations, we're getting caught with looking at our kids' chronological age instead of their development.
And sometimes it's hard too, because I know, like with my own child, some developmental things, she seemed older. Like
Yes.
educationally, she was older, but in brushing her teeth, she was younger. Like
Yes.
finally brushes her teeth on her own, thank goodness, before she moved out of the house. But that's a struggle. She was years below other peers, right?
Yep. Well, because there wasn't a motivation yet for it. It wasn't until there was some kind of love interest come along the pike that changed. That behavior probably changed, right? Maybe, or something. But I mean, I think that's it entirely. Is that part of what marks these complex kids is that there's such a disparity in their capability. They are so advanced in some areas and so far behind developmentally in others, usually having to do with executive function challenges, right? But they can have this articulate, thoughtful, well-argued conversation. They can debate you to the nine, right? Like, what? But then they can't sort of, figure out how to set an alarm and wake up in the morning. And that disparity is what makes us crazy as parents.
Right.
I mean, it really makes us wildly crazy because we don't know who we're getting at any given moment.
That's true.
Right?
Very true.
But if we start with the assumption that they're doing their best, right, and that what we're getting is what they're capable of in that, for whatever that issue is, then we can let go of some of those expectations, or at least shift them to meet them more appropriately. Diane always says that if a kid can't do what you're asking them to do 80% of the time consistently, then they're probably not quite ready to do that on their own.
Well, here's the $1,000,000 question from
Okay.
Jenna. How do you identify the motivation component? How do we find motivation outside of Snickers bars?
Okay, so this is a favorite concept. We teach it in the book. It's in Sanity School. It's on the website. Like anywhere you want it, you can get it. But it's got some good stories around it in the book. So basically, there are 5 things that motivate the ADHD brain, the complex brain, the executive function starved brain, whatever you want to call it. Okay. And remember what I said, it's not that they're not motivated, it's just that they're more highly motivated to do something else than what you want them to do. So you have to understand what they are motivated to do. And they could be motivated to do nothing. That's a high motivation because that requires absolutely no effort, right? They could, and so I have a son who I finally figured out I had to understand I had a son, I still have this son. I had to understand that he really has a value around efficiency and doing things with the least amount of energy. Like he thinks people waste too much time and people work too hard. And that's actually a value for him. So when I stopped, trying to force him to be a hard worker, because that's my value, and realized he kind of has this chill approach to the world, and it's kind of what's lovely about him, then I could shift my expectations and kind of meet him where he is. But anyway, I got sidetracked. What was I saying? Bring me back.
Finding their motivation.
Oh, finding motivation. Okay. So there are 5 motivations for the ADHD brain. And the acronym that we use to describe this is PINCH. Okay. PINCH. 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 P. And so what you have to understand again is that they are motivated. You just don't know what they're motivated for. So one of the ways to really help a kid is to begin to explore what does motivate them. Generally, like when they are motivated to play video games or to hang with a friend or to, help with dinner or whatever it is, what is it about it that's attracting them, right? Because remember, we've got kids who are stimulation seekers. So what's the stimulus that they're seeking? What are they looking for? Okay. So PINCH stands for, P stands for play. So that might be play, creativity, humor, it could be the arts, could be dance, could be laughter. Sometimes it's the class clown. But someone who really enjoys play, this kind of a lightness. These are the kids who, and there are a lot of kids with ADHD, you can guide them through their ADD by finding the humor in life. Like humor is enough to motivate them to do all sorts of things. Or it's at least enough to get them started. When my son was little, it was reading the comics. Like he loved the comics. And so I could use the comics as a kind of a lever to, well, you can have this after you get the homework done, or, that kind of thing. So play, which includes creativity and humor, is a motivator for a lot, which is why in some classrooms, when there's, classroom Jeopardy, the kid who's been quiet all the time will all of a sudden show up to Jeopardy because there's a game involved. And that's why gamification is becoming so big, because people like to play. And it's underrated. I mean, we try to train the play out of people, but the truth is adults kind of like to play too. If you've ever noticed people who play, golf or flying or, all the hobbies we do, it's because we're playing, right? We're having a good time. And so if we can use the play to our advantage, that's a great motivator. The next one is I. I stands for interest. So these are often the kids who really love a teacher, or they love a subject matter, or they're curious about something. Oftentimes these kids are very curious. They're self-explorers. They may not get their homework done, but they've researched everything there is to know about ancient, like hieroglyphs or something. They're explorers, and they're interested in something. It just may not be what you want them to be interested in, but finding their interests can be really powerful. Some kids are really not motivated, and not just kids, this is kids and adults. Okay, some of us are motivated by novelty. Novelty is the newness, the unexplained, the unexpected, the uncertain. Some people who are doing great in the pandemic, doing great because they thrive on not knowing what's going to happen next, right? Some people really like the new. I know it's hard to believe, but it is true. Some people are like, I'm right in my element. But novelty is so these are kids who are doing really, really well at the beginning of a school year. And then the novelty wears off. It's no longer a new class or a new teacher or a new schedule or a new notebooks or whatever. And they do great for a while. And then by about October, they're about done. And it's all they can do to make it through to the end of the semester. I remember when my son would come to me in February, he'd say, I'm done. I'm just done with school this year. I'm done. I'm like, you made it a week longer. I'm the host now. So I don't know what to do. I think I'm just going to keep going. So N is for novelty, and those are the kids who really need things to change. So if you're somebody who really likes systems, one of the things that happens with novelty seekers is that you may have a system that's working really, really great, and it's just gotten too boring. And so you may have a kid who wants to change it up or do it differently. And it's not because they They don't. Hey, Kristen, I'm glad you're back. So sometimes the novelty, or they change the system, not because the system wasn't working, but because they're bored and they're no longer interested in the system. Are you here?
I think.
Can you hear me?
And keep going.
Okay, all right. So that's N is for novelty. And so keep in mind as an adult that often shows up in reorganizing something that was already terribly well organized, and that you just have to reorganize it because the way it was done is just no longer interesting to you. So that's novelty. And then C is for competition. Some people are really motivated by competition, some people are not. So you have to watch out. That one's one that I think is overused in the schools generally. Tends to be a little rougher for people with anxiety who may not want as much competition. Some kids really like competition with others. Some kids really like competition with themselves, but they don't want competition with others. So understanding when a kid is competing, when they want to best themselves, or when it's really important to them that to be competitive with their peers, that can be a great motivator. And then the last motivator is what we call hurry up, or urgency. The H stands for hurry up. And that's about, actually, it's what's interesting about this last motivator is the first four motivators: play, interest, novelty, and competition. They're all coming from the front of the brain, from the frontal lobe of the brain, the executive function of the brain, right? The urgency factor is coming from a different part of the brain. It's actually the amygdala. The primitive brain is jumping in and trying to threaten you into getting something done, right? Maybe it's time, maybe it's a deadline, but it's the sense that I've got to get it done, and I wait until I've got to get it done at the last minute to get something done because I need that urgency to get the hormones firing to get yourself to get anything done. Urgency gets a bad rep. It is not a bad motivation. It's just not really healthy to use it as your only motivator, because over time, if you're constantly using urgency to motivate yourself, you're going to stress yourself out, and it's going to become a constant stress cycle in your body. I think it has a lot to do with adult issues, with adult illnesses, right? Because we're constantly waiting to the last minute, hitting that deadline to get ourselves to get anything done. So we want to allow kids to use that tool, that motivator, but we don't want it to be the only ones in their toolbox. So and I had a client who was saying to me today, the biggest change that's happened for her with her 15-year-old son is realizing that the only motivator he had was urgency, and the only motivator that she was using with him was urgency, because she's an adult with ADD, and that's the only one she ever was aware that she had. And so just beginning to see, okay, what else can provide motivation besides that has been really powerful in shifting the dynamic in their home. So those are the 5 key motivators: PINCH, right? And I think that's it on that. So, and I'm waiting for Kristen to come back.
So sorry, I don't know what's going on with the internet.
You're having an internet glitch. It's all good. So was there any follow-up on that, or did that kind of hit the question?
I missed a lot of that, so I apologize. I had the sound off on my phone. I can see that you're still streaming, so I'm like, okay, that part's good, but I can't.
Right, I'm getting a note saying you're the host now. You're the host now. I'm like, okay, I got this. I'll just keep going.
Just keep going. There was one more question. Looks like Jeremy posted it from the group, is what she says. And it says, my 14-year-old with ADHD lies all the time about literally everything. If he brushed his teeth, if he turned in the assignment, if he fed the dog, sometimes multiple lies in the space of 5 minutes. And she understands that that's normal for a teen with ADHD, but still have to do something about it. Double check everything. It feels exhausting.
I bet it is exhausting. Yeah. And, and the thing is to understand, as I was saying earlier, is to try to begin to explore with each one what's really going on. So fed the dog could very well be, well, I remembered feeding the dog yesterday, so I thought I fed the dog, right? That's what happens with turning in homework and feeding the dog. And when you've got working memory issues, it's very, very common for kids to be like, well, but I did that already. Well, no, you actually did that yesterday. And yesterday feels like today, because our kids have two time frames. There's now and there's not now. And I did that during not now, right? So that's part of it is maybe some innocent working memory mistakes going on there. And so maybe you need to talk about, since it's hard to say, why don't we put some measure or system or accountability in place to make sure the dogs are fed, because you don't want the dogs to go hungry. And I mean, your kid doesn't want the dog to go hungry, I promise. You know, they're not doing it to starve the dog. And so you have to help them see what's involved and what the consequence is, and connect it to what's in it for them. They love their dog. I mean, chances are, if not, that's probably the wrong person to be feeding the dog. And then we have other issues to talk about. But really, the best question you can ask yourself when you're trying to address any issue with your kids in terms of a solution or trying to fix a problem is, what's in it for them? Because we know what's in it for us, but we forget that they're humans too, and we really need to also consider what's in it for them. What's the value or benefit to them? So if a kid is lying all the time, begin to break it down and figure out how much of it is defensive because they're getting caught for everything they do wrong and they're tired of being wrong, and how much of it is working memory. They think they did it and they forgot and aren't sure, and they, again, maybe that be the other thing is, when a kid is lying a lot, I generally see that there may be an environment at home where it's not okay to make mistakes. And if a kid is in an environment where they don't feel safe making mistakes, then they're going to try to cover it up. Doesn't matter how little or big it is. And I was being interviewed on something else, and I was talking about this, and I remembered my own childhood, and I realized that I spent a lot of time in my life avoiding doing lots of things so that I wouldn't do them wrong. And it was not an intentional thing that was created in my family of origin, but it was kind of an accidental outcome for being a family where expectations were high and achievement was expected. And so if I was afraid I wasn't going to hit the mark, I would just not do it. I'd avoid. And so you want to look at how are you dealing with mistakes in your home? In what ways are you making it okay to make mistakes? Are they able to make mistakes without feeling any judgment around them? Are they learning to fail forward? All of this stuff is talked about in the book, failing forward, making it okay, make mistakes, creating an environment that shifts how you're dealing with mistakes can be really powerful, particularly with ADHD, because y'all, those of us with ADD, we make more mistakes. We just do. And if we beat ourselves up for every one of them, we will spend the rest of our lives going through our lives, which most adults with ADD do, hitting ourselves over the head with a stick, right? Because we beat ourselves up because we do feel bad and we do feel ashamed and we do feel embarrassed. So if you can help your child be with the mistakes they're making without shame and embarrassment, without judgment, that shift alone, I promise you, will eliminate a significant portion of the lying. It's really quite extraordinary. I was talking to a couple this morning that I'm working with, and they have a 15-year-old son, and they were talking about a conversation they had with their son, and they had been dealing with a lot of issues and, lying and some substance discussion, a lot of stuff going on. And they were starting to have a conversation with their son, and he was lying on the couch, facing away from them, barely acknowledging them, but he was in the room, right? And instead of having a conversation that was another one of those, son, this is what we expect of you, and you're failing to me, like one of those, we'd planned this out, and they said, okay, we're going to clean the slate. The dad said, I realized that I've been, judgmental and disappointed in you. And the mom was like, I realized I've been a little too controlling. And he rolled over and faced them. And they said by the time the conversation was over, he was sitting up and he was engaged and he was looking at both of them. And he was actively involved in the conversation, because all of a sudden it wasn't, this is what you're doing wrong. It was, wow, this is what we've been doing wrong to not meet you where you are. And we want to be able to have a relationship with you that's different. And it changed everything in a single conversation. Now we'll see where we are in a month or two, right? But the real challenge isn't with him because he's already responding differently. The challenge was in the parent shifting and saying, wow, I've been really disapproving of my son. That must be terrible for him. Right? Yeah, it was pretty awesome. It really was. So one of the other things we wanted to, are there other questions you want to hit, Kristen? Because one of the other things we wanted to talk a little bit about consequences and punishment. And there's some interesting stuff actually I learned as I was writing the book about this, because I've struggled over the years with all of this language about what's a consequence and what makes a consequence, and people are always asking, how do I make natural consequences? And I mean, I think it can be really confusing for a lot of parents. I'm not supposed to do punishment, but what's a consequence? And what I realized when I was writing the book is that we tend to call it a consequence, but it's still a punishment. And we think we're putting consequences in place, but really we're punishing. We're just calling it something different so that we can feel better about it. And so what I realized just this week, and I got to go back and see how I talk about it in the book because I can't remember, but what I realized this week is somebody asked me what makes a good consequence. And I said, a good consequence is when it's been established in advance and clearly communicated. Consequences are only consequences if they've been determined in advance and clearly communicated. Now, sometimes there are systemic consequences in the world. You may not know what your fine is going to be if you speed, but you know you're going to have a fine when you speed if you get pulled over, right? So that's a natural consequence. You speed, you get pulled over, you have a ticket. You know in advance, there's an agreement, there's a contract, right? And you know you're gonna have a consequence. It's clearly identified and communicated.
Do you think that's why so many kids do better at school? Because teachers have written protocols and they're very structured and you know the consequences. I know at home to some extent it's because kids show their worst behavior to the people they love and trust the most. So they're going to be naughtier for their family just because they're naughtier for their family.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. But if you got a rubric and you know if this is 2 days late, I'm going to lose 10 points. You get to decide whether you're going to lose those 10 points. Now, if you've got learning disabilities or ADD, you may need to, that may be a different issue. But yeah, that when it's clear and established, you know what the rule is, you know what the consequence is going to be. That's a consequence. If your kids get into an argument at dinner and you're like, okay, everybody turn your phones in at 9 o'clock tonight. That's your consequence for this behavior is turn your phones in at 9 o'clock. That is not a consequence. That is a punishment. And we can call it anything you want, but if they don't know how to anticipate and change their behavior based on what the outcome is going to be, it's not a natural consequence. Now you can have an arbitrary consequence. You can say, you've got to do this, you've got to take the trash out, and if you don't, then you don't get your allowance, right? It doesn't have to be a natural result of, but they have to have it established in advance in some form. And what we know about kids with ADHD in particular is punishment doesn't work. It's what I started talking about earlier. It's that cause and effect thing, right? It's not going to change the behavior if the behavior is not naughty, right? But a consequence can begin to do that to some extent, because now it may not if it's an impulsivity issue, right? Like you have to make it appropriate. If you're asking a kid not to, let's say, remember back in the classrooms when if you're asking a kid not to blurt out in class, right? So in that case, you may not have a punitive consequence for the behavior because he's impulsive and he's having a hard time managing it, but you might put some incentives in place to help him begin to catch himself when he, or he might get an incentive for, he went to blurt and he stopped. He might get points for that. Or you might have a fidget that you keep on his desk, like a piece of Velcro, so he has something he can play with, or a structure that he uses to write down what he was going to say. Like, you begin to train him and help him train himself to learn to manage that impulsivity with positive structures and incentives. But that's a behavior that he's not intending to blurt, right?
Right.
That makes sense.
Family, I don't know, however many years ago, really good teacher who really was invested in this kiddo. And he was one of those kids that would impulsively blurt out or do things. And they came up with a system, I don't know, she tapped her head or something. If she saw him about ready to do something, she did a signal. And I don't remember what the signal was.
Brilliant.
But he then could see that. And that was his reminder, oh, I'm not supposed to do that. I need to raise my hand. Because she would tap her head or her shoulder or whatever.
Perfect example. So she saw his tell before he was recognizing it.
Right. And she
right. And she taught him to recognize his tell by doing that. It's brilliant. It's a great strategy.
Yeah.
But you want it to be something he was clearly in communication. It was identified. This is what's going to happen when. That was an incentive, right? But if it's just, we hear parents all the time that'll say things like, if you get straight A's, then you get to do this next summer or whatever. Well, if they knew how to get straight A's, they probably would. But because there's a lot of pieces involved with getting straight A's, and it's kind of a process-oriented thing, it's not fair to set that up. You've got to break it down and walk them through the process a little bit more manageably. Or I hear a lot, if you don't get straight A's, then you won't, right? Then there's this penalty. And yes, that's communicated in advance. And yes, it's clearly communicated. It's decided in advance and it's clearly communicated. But you also want to make sure that it makes sense, that what you're asking is a fair and reasonable request. So that they can have the capacity to exercise some control over it. And I think that's where we get lost. We get messed up a bunch, is we set expectations that are out of alignment with what our kids are really capable of yet. And I know they're going to have to do all this stuff on their own when they're adults. I know that. And that doesn't mean they're ready to yet. In fact, they're not adults yet, thankfully.
Time and again from parents who say, but I know he's capable because he's really smart. And smart isn't the same thing as getting A's.
No, because he's really smart, and smart people do stupid stuff too, just so you know.
Or they forget to turn the papers in routinely. I mean,
they what?
They forget to turn the papers in.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, smart has got nothing to do with it, but you want to guide our kids through a process of decision making and of the process of learning how to put systems in place to manage themselves. Like that's the big picture. That's what all of this is about. And if it's how do I get my paper in, or how do I not blurt out in class, or how do I not explode when I'm disappointed and because I've been playing a video game and I lost. It's huge, right?
Yes.
And it's hard. And think about how many people who lose jobs in the workplace because they exploded, because they didn't learn emotional regulation and didn't learn emotional management. That if you can shift from, one of the things I talk about in the book is don't get furious, get curious. Right? What's going on? Understand what's behind the behavior, then you can begin to slowly, steadily take aim on changing the behavior. But if you just judge the behavior, it's going to be hard to make those changes.
Very true.
What else? Anything else we want to?
I don't see any other questions. Did you have any other tidbits that you wanted to talk about? Any other topics?
Let me think about it. There's so many things. There's so many things that I love. Here's what I want to, one of the premise that I've sort of started with here that I haven't really explained, and I guess this is really what I want to talk about, is that when you're trying to help your kids learn to manage their ADD or their impulsivity or their anxiety or whatever it is they're trying to manage, It starts by understanding them and helping them learn to understand themselves, right? That's the kind of basic premise here. But part of what it takes to understand them and help them learn to manage themselves is to kind of keep ourselves out of it. And a lot of us parent um, in the coaching world, we would call it a level one. A lot of us parent from a place of, you did this to me. How could you do this to me? Why aren't you more grateful to me? Like, a lot of us think, and I don't mean to say that in a judgy way. It's just kind of our natural default as we go through the world and think about how the world affects us. And if we can, in the process of parenting, begin to shift out of that and really be in a child-centered place, really think about what's happening in their experience, what's it like for them, and how can I help them learn to understand themselves better. That's the key. That's the magic to be able to help them learn to self-regulate or self-manage or whatever it is. But that shift starts with managing ourselves first. And that may be, if we yell, that may be not yelling, it may be not avoiding, it may be not controlling. Like, there are all kinds of behaviors. One of the things that see if I have a copy of it in the new book that we introduced was a bunch of new avatars. So our avatars are like the moms and the dads. We've got dads now, y'all, happy to report. So here's some pictures. Can you see?
Yeah.
Right. So there's Angry Ann and Andy, there's Supermom Sue, there's Lost Lois, Maxed Out Maxine, Fix It Fran, Nagging Nan, Anxious Ava, right? So we have all these parent responses now that we're looking at. Like, there are all these different ways that we as parents respond to our kids with their complex issues. There's Denying, Defensive Drew, and Bootstraps Bill. There are all these different characters. And all of us have several of these, right? At some point or another. And what we want to do is get to that inner conscious Connie or conscious Carl, the parent who can kind of zen through parenting and handle it without getting upset. But if we can recognize the ways in which we tend to react, and I want to make the distinction between reacting and responding. If we can look and understand our tendencies to react, maybe we're getting anxious, maybe we're afraid, maybe we're demanding, right? Whatever it is, then as we learn to manage ourselves and our own emotions and our own reactivity, we can then begin to respond in a way that our kids need. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is the difference between reacting and responding. Because when we react, we tend to be in a very me-centered place. And when we respond, we're able to really see what's going on with our kids and meet them and be about supporting them instead of making it be about us. And so I think that's what I want to close with, is a conversation around your role, right? One of the things we teach is in the book and in Sanity School is the 4 stages of the role of the parent. All of us start in phase 1 as directors. Like, we're really good at that. You know, we know how to tell them what to do and what their motivation should be, and we're all in, right? Where we struggle is that the next phase is collaboration. And we really want to move through collaboration with them, where now they're beginning to take on some ownership so that we can get them to the next phase. But remember, we're the one that's collaborating, not them. They're just kids growing up. We're collaborating, and then we want to move to a place where they're taking ownership and we're supporting. So our role shifts from director to collaborator to supporter. And then finally, when they become adults, to, cheerleader, wise sage, whatever you want to call it. And so what's really essential for us to understand is that it's not about them and where they are. They're going to dance and respond to how we treat them. So if we treat them like they're little kids who can't handle anything, they're going to behave like they're little kids who can't handle anything. And if you treat them like they're capable of more, they'll begin to rise to that occasion. Maybe not the first time, because they may not trust yet that you're really for real, but you can begin to learn how to shift your approach to supporting them in a way that gets them to begin to support themselves. And, you know, I work with a lot of parents who end up sometimes, you know, we work with parents on all kinds of ranges. Like some parents of kids where it's academic issues, sometimes it's social issues or family issues, sometimes it's kids who've been in treatment programs or in therapeutic programs. And inevitably, what's happening as kids move into the teenage years in particular is you're dealing with these control issues that we were talking about earlier. And usually it's because the parent is still parenting the kid like they're 7 and the kid's ready to be parented like they're 14 or 16 or 18, right? And so if we can learn how to shift how we're parenting them, then they will begin to shift how they're parenting themselves, basically, right? How they're taking care of themselves. So the change that I'm talking about, I know it sounds daunting because you got all this stuff on your plate and you kind of don't want anything else on your plate. But I guess what I want you to hear is that when you do start paying attention to how you're approaching your kids, when you do start learning this shift in approach, it actually lightens your load. It actually makes it easier to get things done around the house. It improves your relationship with your kids dramatically, which is why most of us became parents in the first place, right? It sets you up for a long-term relationship. And that change is about you, and that the focus of that change is more on you than I think most of us really understand or want to believe. It's hard to see because the kid's got the problem, right? But the change, it really starts with us, y'all. So that's kind of where I would close is to know that you've got this and you can make an enormous difference in the life of your child. Enormous, however old, whether your kid is 3, 13, 23, or 33. Like this applies no matter what age. And it doesn't hurt with spouses either. Just saying. It's a really good approach. But whatever age your child is, if you want to improve the dynamic and your relationship with them and how you're communicating with them to foster their independence, then the coach approach is the way to go. And it really has a profound transformation ability. And that starts with you, which you have control over, actually. So that's the good news. You can't control them, but you can control how you respond.
That is just on the spot.
Right? It's bottom line. You cannot control what happens. I mean, look at what's happened this year. We cannot control what happens. We can control how we choose to respond to whatever happens. And what I want for all of you is to really lean into managing yourself so that you can respond consciously instead of reacting reactively, right?
Right. And that is huge right now for everyone to take care of self, eating, right, exercise, sleeping, having time to just mentally just decompress every day. However you do that.
Reading a good book.
Yeah. I will get your book. I have to get your book. I've been a little busy. But yeah.
I know. No guilt. None at all. Not at all. But you will find, Kristen, how you'll be amazed at how that your kid's not too old. Like I have a mom and she did a review on Amazon, and I would ask any of you who know me already have the book, if you have it, please write a review on Amazon. But she wrote a review and she took a picture of the side of the book, and it's like dog-eared and they're like 60, pages folded down. She said she read through it first and everybody said it's a really quick read. And then she's gone back through the highlighter. Her child is 33.
Oh, wow.
Right. So really, this is not about them. It's about us.
Very true.
Yeah.
So never too late to learn.
No, and it's kind of fun. My daughter-in-law said the nicest thing to me, my daughter's getting married soon. She was reading it and she said, I feel like I'm using it to parent myself.
Interesting.
Which I really loved. It was like, all right, that'll work for me. I like that, because I think a lot of us, especially adults with ADD, we didn't have a model for how do you parent yourself or be kind to yourself with ADD, how to understand yourself or have compassion for yourself. You know, we were raised in a lot of stress and judgment. So, so yeah, there's definitely something in it for everybody, especially or including adults who have ADD or complex issues themselves. Anxiety too, a lot of stuff. The anxiety is getting clearer and clearer as I get older.
I think, yeah, anxiety is a very popular diagnosis.
Yep, especially of late.
Yes.
Well, and I do think that part of what happens, particularly with girls and women with ADHD, is that the ADHD goes undiagnosed and it manifests as anxiety.
Yeah.
And I know that for me, when I started to manage the ADHD, it was like, wow, did the anxiety dissipate? I'm not saying it's gone, but I was a really neurotic Jewish mother. I mean, and that is not how you would describe me now. My kids might, but no, I'm kidding. You know, I'm really not. A lot of that anxiety dissipated when I learned to manage the ADD.
Yeah. Well, we are past an hour. I really did not expect to talk this long. I do have one really easy question. Oh, it looks like Jeremy already answered it. Someone asked what your book was called, and it's The Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids. Thank you, Jeremy,
ADHD, anxiety, and more. Here, I'll show you.
There you go.
Guide to Raising Complex Kids.
There was another
Thank you for
question that's a
asking.
little bit longer, and I don't know if you want to tackle that now or maybe just.
I'll do a thumbnail of it.
Okay.
Throw it at me and we'll do a quick.
How might you respond to a teen whom you want to treat more like someone with more responsibility, and that child would prefer to stay a child, not in a bad way, but sees childhood as a loving, safe place and doesn't want to move on?
Fair. I had a couple of those. Fair. Little incremental steps. So acknowledge, can't blame them. Grown-ups do all that work, you know, can understand it. I think we force our kids to grow up too fast. And there is something beautiful about a childish naivete, and there's something quite lovely about a kid who's not racing to grow up. So if you've got a kid who's not racing, embrace it, enjoy it, and take aim on little things one at a time to help them. There's actually a section about this issue is actually covered in the book because my kids are kind of, I have this whole thing. It's like, what's so wrong with immaturity? They're going to get there eventually, and they're going to have all these responsibilities eventually. Why do we have to rush it?
Yeah, I'd much rather my child be immature and safe than grow up and doing all kinds of things that get them into physical or emotional dangers.
Exactly. So meet them where they are, pace yourself. I get that, parents all the time, it's like, but I want my kid to drive. I know you want them to drive. If they are telling you they're not ready to drive, you should listen to that because driving is kind of dangerous, right? And when they're ready, they'll let you know. So I think it's a great question. And I know it's hard and frustrating, and just honor it, stay playful, and then look for little places to begin to take on a little bit more responsibility and take aim. This is a thing we teach. Take aim on one thing at a time, but don't try to take aim on too much. Let your kid be a kid.
Exactly. So, well, thank you.
All right, my friend.
Are
we good?
Awesome. We could talk for another hour, but I really hate to keep you. You're an hour later than we are in your time zone. So
true. Well, it's been lovely. I have a special place in my heart for ADHD KC. So so thank you for having me, because one of my first travel speeches I ever gave was to ADHD KC.
Oh, really?
Years ago. That's when I met Jeremy, was when I came in to speak. And so that must have been like 7 years ago. I mean, it was a while. It was a long time ago.
Wow.
But so you guys hold a very special place in my heart.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You've been amazing. Thank you. And for everyone who joined us late, this should be recorded and available on our Facebook page. And eventually it will get put onto our YouTube channel and our website so that everyone can watch it, even if they don't follow Facebook.
Super.
Yeah. All right.
Take care, everybody. Just remember, you've got this. Slow and steady. You've got this.
Awesome. Very practical advice. So thank you very much. And